morning, friends. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 1 of the Gita and how it relates to our lives and how to deal with living. An example that Gautam Jain just gave us in a previous episode was driving on a highway. He said, before you drive on a highway, you need to learn how to drive. You can't just get behind the wheel of a car and start driving and expect to know what the rules are and how to conduct yourself on the road. Similarly, we need to get some guidance about living, how to deal with stress and strife, and how to deal with life. And we don't come to this world, we're not born with manuals telling us how to live. And just before, 5 minutes before we got onto this program, Lou, good morning, Lou.
Good morning.
Just before we got on, Lou had asked me a question. Lou, you want to say that question out aloud?
Yes, one of the things about you that I'm always fascinated about, and what I find interesting about you and your approach and your story here, is you have another discipline. You're a psychiatrist. You were medically trained in psychology and psychiatry, worked with the mind quite a bit in your practice, obviously, over the years. Then you came across this discipline of the Gita, and I'm wondering how you reconcile the two, and whether it's easy to pair the two together, or where there's some struggles in some areas and some principles fit really nicely. How do you relate to the Gita as a psychiatrist? How do you make those two things interact with each other?
Perfect question. And I had actually never thought about this, Lou, so I'm grateful to you for bringing this out, how the Gita relates to being a psychiatrist and helping people. And being a physician. I mean, after all, when you're a physician, even if you're not a psychiatrist, people come to you and say, Doc, I got a problem.
Yeah.
And when you're a psychiatrist, those problems are mainly having to do with life, relationships, stress, strain, etc. And that's exactly what the Gita teaches you. And you'll see that what we're going to talk about today in chapter 1, and it wasn't as if I set this up for you to ask me this question. It's perfect, because chapter 1 basically talks about how to deal with stress, strain, what the Gita is necessary for. And your question about how does it meld with or relate to my work as a psychiatrist, it actually enhances it. It is really, the Gita is like a psychiatrist giving us a manual on how to live life and so on.
Now,
so it's perfect.
As a layperson, can I lay out a principle that I think has become important here?
Please.
And you can correct me if you think I'm wrong. I think that a lot of us get lost in our emotions, and we think we are our emotions, but there is another level. There's an intellect. What we're talking about is intellect and mind here. And this is all about separating the two and letting the intellect control the emotions and the mind. Is that fair? Is that fair or accurate enough?
Very, very fair, very accurate.
Yeah.
For those of you who may not have looked at the session where I talked about the basics that you must know before you understand the Gita, I talked about the difference between the mind and the intellect.
Right.
First, the lowest level is the body. And above that comes the mind, and above that comes the intellect. And the mind is just full of emotions, as Lou was just saying. Emotions which are desires, fears, wants, needs, those kind of things. And the mind does not worry about consequences to you. It just says, I want this. I want this money. And the mind is driven by...
I'm afraid of this, or I don't want this.
Correct.
Often more powerful with people, I don't want this.
The mind is driven by desires, which in Sanskrit are known as vasanas. And those desires could be for wealth, for beauty, for fame, for sex, for all of the things that titillate and activate the sense organs.
Right.
So our sense organs and the mind work together with the desires to get us into trouble. Above that is the king. The king is the intellect. The king is supposed to be powerful enough to control the mind and the body, but instead is often asleep at the wheel.
Right.
Why? Because we've never trained it. From an early age, where thousands of years ago people recognized that there was such a thing as an intellect, we don't have that. We don't teach our children how to train the intellect as of today.
I'll go further. I don't think we know it exists. I think a lot of people don't understand. They think their mind and those reactions and those emotions are who they are.
That is so true.
Yeah.
Because, even going through medical school, there was no such thing, no concept as in psychiatry of this thing which in Sanskrit is known as buddhi. Buddhi is the Sanskrit word for intellect, but it's different from intelligence. It's different from intellect as the layperson would see it. The intellect, basically, its only function is, should I do this or should I do that? Is this right or is that right? And as I said before, there is a gross intellect, which deals with terrestrial things like physics, math, the world, that kind of stuff, mathematics, business. And then there's a subtle intellect, and the subtle intellect is of the spiritual level and things that are non-terrestrial,
Right.
as we're talking about right now.
It's the difference between thinking I am afraid and thinking I'm feeling fear.
Yes.
Because the observer's understanding that they're feeling fear, the person who's into their emotions and thinks that who they are says, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and the intellect then basically says, what are you afraid of? And says, should I be afraid of
Is
this?
it real?
Is it real or is it not real?
Right. Yeah.
So,
Or as I like to put it, do you have a fear or do you have a problem? A fear is an emotion and a reaction. A problem is an actual thing. It's testing all of your emotions to see if they're real and seeing if they're justified.
So basically, in the Gita, going to chapter 1, an introduction is the Gita is just one small piece of a much bigger spiritual text that is called the Mahabharata. Maha means great. Bharat was the name of India before before the British came in and started calling it India, which comes from the river Indus. So India. But Mahabharata is Great India. And the Mahabharata is a text that was spoken. There was no writing at the time. Everybody just spoke it and people just learned it. The Mahabharata is bigger than Homer's Iliad and Odyssey put together, plus many more.
And the Gita is just the first chapter?
And the Gita is a chapter stuck in the middle.
As chapter stuck in the middle. Wow.
And the Gita itself has 700 verses.
Wow.
And the Gita is I have 3 volumes of the Gita that I'm studying from, and that's just one chapter in the Mahabharata. So you can just imagine how big this volume is. But the Mahabharata is not something that I want to go into over here, but it's necessary to understand where you come to in the Gita. But since this is an introduction to chapter 1, it is very necessary to understand. So imagine that whenever the Mahabharata was written, and people don't know exactly when it was written, but it's definitely before the 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago as of today.
Yes.
At that time, there were kings, and people ruled over the country, and there was a princely family who was, through vicious, cruel, unfair, illegal means, kicked out of the position of being king by the cousins. So there were 2 cousin families. The 5 that were kicked out, the real rulers, were 5 brothers known as the Pandavas. Pan means 5, Pandavas, were kicked out, and for 13 years they were banished to the forests. And then the Kauravas, basically the larger group of clan of cousins, were 100 of them. Now this is important because although nobody knows whether the Gita is actually true in terms of historical significance, whether the Mahabharata was true, whether a war called the Mahabharata War took place or didn't take place. Some people say there's remnants of it, you can see it. And some people say, no, this was just
a parable.
Yeah. We don't know. But there is a mixture. If it was true, there's definitely things in there that were added to make it symbolic enough for people to understand.
Sure.
So the symbolism.
license.
Sorry?
Dramatic license.
Dramatic license, right. So the symbolism is thought of to say 5 Pandava brothers are really our 5 senses.
Yes.
And the 100 Kaurava brothers, the cousins, are the hundreds of assaults and temptations that we're faced with in life.
Right.
So the 5 brothers are fighting against 100, and ultimately they are victorious. That's the end. But how they go through that is what this whole thing is all about. So the one brother, Arjuna, is the king, and he's been through many, many, many battles throughout his life. He's not afraid of battles. He's an expert a warrior, warrior par excellence, and he has defeated everybody. He's been undefeated. And he's been waiting 13 years for this war to take place. 13 years. And he's tried everything up to that point to try to reason with his 100 cousins who are totally corrupt and illegal. And for 13 years he said, listen, if it doesn't come to this, if they don't listen, then we have to go to war. And he's eager for it. Well, when he comes to the battlefield, he drives his chariot out, and there's two armies, his army on one side and the Kaurava army on the other side. He drives his chariot with Krishna as his charioteer, and we talked about the symbolism of the chariot, right to the middle of the battlefield between the two armies, and he stops there. And this major warrior is so shaken, his hand starts to quiver, his knees turn to jelly, his sword and his bow and arrow drop from his arms and fall down, and he starts to sweat and shake, and he says, I can't do this. And he says, I can't do this not because I'm afraid, but because this is my kith and kin. This is my blood. These are my cousins. I can't kill them. These are my uncles over there. These are people I know. Beating them, defeating them is not an issue.
Right.
I know of that, but I just can't do it, and I collapse with fear. So again, that symbolism behind this is that people like you and me, Lou, people like all of us friends, we go through life thinking that, everything's fine, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and then last minute, when you least expect it, you're caught between two major conflicts. And at that time, something that you think you can handle very simply, and you were asking me about a psychiatrist, how do you deal with this? We succumb to our fears and anxieties, and we drop our methods of dealing with this, just drops out. Our hands start shaking, knees start turning to jelly. We say, I can't deal with this. And what Krishna starts to tell him in chapter 1 and then goes on to chapter 18 is how to deal with this fear. So that in the first chapter,
Krishna's doing a therapy session right there in the middle of the battlefield.
Yes. So that is why I say that, obviously that part has to be symbolic, because in real war, you can't stop both armies and say, hold on, I'm going to talk. And this is a long 18 chapters.
18 chapters, yes.
Everybody's on hold while you go through this philosophical
For a movie,
expertise.
this would be a flashback.
Right. So that is something we will probably have to talk about next time. But I remember the son of an Indian American family. He was a teenager, 18, 19. One time we were talking about the Gita, and he said to me, he said, what kind of religion is this? You're telling me that Krishna is telling Arjuna he should fight and he should battle, and that's a religion? You said that somebody who's holy to you is telling the other person to go kill? That's not a religion. But remember, this was 5,000 years ago, first of all. Secondly, it's like saying to a general or a police officer that when you're faced with a terrorist, he says, you know what, I can't kill this terrorist. I'm going to put my sword down or my gun down. You say, listen, first of all, you took an oath. You're a police officer. There's a terrorist coming at me, killing the whole country, because that's how these people were depicted as in the Mahabharata. These Kauravas were depicted as terrorists, taking advantage of women, children, innocent people, just purely for their own selfish needs and greed. And it was Arjuna's job and the 5 Pandava brothers to basically bring them to justice. And at the time, it's like a police officer saying, look, I can't shoot this, even though I know this guy's a terrorist. And Krishna's teachings to him is, look, you have a duty. You have a sworn duty to fight these bad people. You have to fulfill your duty. You can't let go of your duty.
And sometimes they're in conflict with other feelings that you might have.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that basically is what chapter 1 starts off with in terms of the battle. If you look at many different translations of the Gita, chapter 1 is eliminated, very interestingly. Why? Because most of chapter 1 talks about the different players. It talks about who's on the Kaurava side,
Right.
who's strong, who's on the Pandava side, what their attributes are. And as the Gita goes on to a more philosophical, spiritual discussion, you say, why do I need to know that this person was great in archery and this person was good with sword fighting? And
Right.
what does that have to do with this? I don't want to do
I
it.
don't need their backstories.
So they go straight to
Yeah.
chapter 2. However, what Swami Parthasarathi has done is essentially tease out, even from there, a whole bunch, so much so that I probably won't be able to get to it today, to say what exactly is the author, Vyasa, talking in the Gita about that teaches us even some pearls of advice in chapter 1.
Yeah, he didn't. It wasn't written that way because it wasn't needed. They felt it was needed, and they were trying to accomplish things in that chapter.
Yeah, I've thought about this. I don't know what the reason was. None of us know. We can only speculate. And I've thought about it, and I said, why did he do this? And I said, listen, even when you write a book today, you put things in there that you think are important for the people to. This was written for the layperson.
Right.
The reason the Gita was written was, as we talked last time, is because the Upanishads and the Vedanta was a little too high flown for people 3,000 years ago to understand. Before that, years before that, people understood the Upanishads and Vedanta.
I found that fascinating, the diminishing of the intellect
Yeah.
over the centuries, and it's just our lack of reign over our emotions.
Right.
That's deteriorated, our control over our emotions.
So it was supposed to be a story way of telling people. So and as you read the Gita, if you don't know anything about what we're talking about today, just reading the Gita gives you solace and gives you understanding. So he says this guy was very strong and he could pick up this and he could lift that and he could fight this and he can shoot an arrow. All of that was for the layperson to say, oh, really? Tell me more. I want to hear more of this story.
Right.
Could be. That was my speculation. Nobody says that that's what it was. We don't know.
Spoonful of sugar with the medicine.
Yeah, we don't know what that was.
Right.
But in that, you will find that there are things that are of great importance to us in understanding how to live our lives. And we'll be able to continue with that next time. So, friends, I hope you join us. This is my hope that I am going to discuss what I've learned from Gautamji and Swami Parthasarathi and from reading various books on the Gita, and I have not found anything better than what Swami Parthasarathi has written. And you can look at Swami Parthasarathi's website that we talked about in our last session and learn for yourself. Its videos are on YouTube. But my main purpose in doing this is to get all the 18 chapters of the Gita. It's an ambitious goal, but I hope I can do it, so that you as an average person get some understanding of what the Gita is all about, because so many people have said such good things about it. I've benefited from it, and I hope you do too.
We want people to follow Memoirs of a Psychiatrist on YouTube, on SoundCloud, on Stitcher, on iTunes, probably by the time you've heard this, and of course here on Facebook.
And your comments would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.